Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with the wonderful, the great David Edmonds. David is a philosopher and author of many books, including the bestseller Wittgenstein's Poker. He's a distinguished fellow at Oxford University, and he is also the co-host of the very popular podcast Philosophy Bites with the mighty Nigel Warburton, which has many, many millions of downloads. It's a fantastic podcast. I suggest you all listen to it. And he is the author of the latest book, Parfit, A Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality. And that is what we talk about in this conversation. We start by talking about who was Derek Parfit, why he's kind of unknown in some ways for a lot of people. I think he's known in definitely in moral philosophy and maybe in philosophy circles, but for most folks, he's not a household name. So we talk about some of the reasons for that. We talk about some of his early life, of course. We talk about the impact of his family. I think it's both his parents and both of his grandparents on both sides were all missionaries, Christian missionaries, and the impact that had on his work with morality and him deciding to use a secular morality. We talk about his work with poetry, journalism, photography. We talk about his time in the United States and Oxford. And then we get into some of the themes of Parfit's philosophy, his ideas of personal identity in the self. We talk about unreasons in persons, utilitarianism. We always talk about future persons, the non-identity problem, equality, on what matters, and the legacy of Parfit. I loosely, as I mentioned in the conversation, know about Parfit and his work, and I think I've read his previous book, one of his earlier books, a long time ago. And so reading David's book was great because I was able to learn more about him as a person, but then also his philosophy. David has a really nice writing style. It's very accessible and gets at the crux of many of the issues. And it was just a fabulous read. I mean, it was parts biography, parts philosophy, and it was just, again, really accessible and just a joy to read. So I cannot recommend the book highly enough. And as always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Also on YouTube. You can subscribe and follow there, share widely. And now I bring you David Edmonds. I'm here with David Edmonds. David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you've written an extraordinary book that has kind of caught the attention of people. I've seen it online passed around. I've heard people talk about it. So which is always wonderful, I think, for people to read books and to read your book. So I've been hearing a lot about the book. So I've read it and it's fabulous. So I'm excited to talk to you all about Derek Parfit. Before we get into that, why don't you just tell listeners kind of who you are, kind of your kind of brief background professionally, whatever, and what you're up to now.
Gosh, what am I? I have a sort of portfolio existence. So I now mainly write philosophy books, and I've got a link with the philosophy department at Oxford University in a centre called the UHERO Centre for Practical Ethics. I have my own podcast, which I do with Nigel Warburton, called Philosophy Bites, and a couple of other podcasts called Philosophy 24/7 and Social Science Bites, which focuses on social science. And then until 2 years ago, I'd had a long career at the BBC as a radio program maker where I was part-time. So I'd sort of combined all these things at the same time. But I've given up the BBC part of it, but kept everything else. So, yeah, that's me briefly.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Yeah, I have listened to many of the episodes that you do with Nigel, and it's a fantastic podcast. So I'll plug that for listeners. You all should listen to that as well. It's great. It's great. The book that you have out is called Parfit, A Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality. And this is on Derek Parfit. So the first question I have for you is, who was Derek Parfit? Most people don't know the man and maybe know some of his ideas or maybe his influence or whatever. But Who is he, and why so many people don't know who he is and his work?
Well, people don't know about him because he's a kind of philosopher's secret. I think if you're in the world of philosophy, you will know about Derek Parfit. If you're in the world of moral philosophy, writing about ethics, you will definitely know about Derek Parfit. He was a philosopher who was working in philosophy from about the late 1960s, 1970 all the way through that century, and then he died in 2017. He only wrote 2 books, but they're very, very big books. One book is called Reasons and Persons, comes out in 1984, and the other one's called On What Matters, which comes out in 3 very thick volumes. And 2 of those are published in 2011, I think, and then the final volume is published just posthumously in 2017. So, he only writes these 2 books, but they're full of very, very interesting ideas, and people disagree about which is the most important one. I prefer Reasons and Persons, the early book, work, to the second, but some people value the second book very highly. He writes we can talk about it later, he writes on a whole range of different issues, but he doesn't give interviews. He's not a public philosopher in the way some people are. He's not interested. I mean, if you invited Derek onto your podcast, you almost certainly would have said no. In fact, I tried to get him on Philosophy Bites and failed. He wasn't interested in writing op-ed articles or even writing kind of popular, accessible books. Really, he wanted to stick to writing sort of rigorous analytic philosophy, and as a result, he's much less known than he might otherwise have been.
It's just super interesting. I've read Reasons and Persons a long time ago. I not enough. I read it once and not enough to really remember. I remember liking it. I have not read the more recent one, the big kind of 3-volume. I haven't read those. But I remember his philosophy is obviously very interesting, which is something we'll talk about, major themes. I do want to talk a little bit about his life, because he's an interesting person. Just his philosophy is very interesting, but as a person, he's very interesting. So you said not a very public figure. I'm curious. So I'll start kind of from the beginning. In the beginning of the book, you kind of start about his life and various sequence of things, and people should read the book, so I won't go over all of it. But I am curious though about your ideas on this. So he came from a family of missionaries, right? And I was reading about this in his early life, and I couldn't think how much of that had an impact on what he decided to do for the rest of his life. So he kind of has this moment where he's very young, where he says, he's not into the religious thing. He's essentially agnostic or atheist very early on. But how do you think that there's this idea of he spent time studying moral issues and morality and understanding those things? Do you think that there's anything in the kind of back of the mind about being around a lot of, religious ideas for his childhood that maybe had a kind of imprint on, I don't really want to do the religious thing, but I do care about morals? Because the Christian faith does care about morals and things like that. Do you think there was any kind of imprint there, or do you think it's just kind of coincidental?
No, I think there were a couple of connections. As you say, his mum and dad were missionaries, and both his grandmothers and both his grandfathers were missionaries. So, it's in a way, it was very strange upbringing. So he had missionaries on both sides of the family, and he was born in China, where his mum and dad had gone to be missionary doctors during World War II. I think the 2 effects were, well, firstly, I think he had a kind of missionary zeal, which I think is probably not a coincidence. So he wanted to persuade people that he was right about his philosophy. He was very evangelical about his philosophy. So I think that's one aspect. I think the second is indeed the fact that he was so sort of interested in moral philosophy, and he wanted to put moral philosophy on a secure, secular foundation. So he had this view, which I think is right, which is that philosophers had always, up until very recently, viewed the world and viewed ethics through theology, through God. If you didn't believe in God, as he no longer did, he'd given up his belief, I think, age 7, and he was affected, as so many people are, by the kind of problem of evil, the idea that if there was an all-powerful, all-good God, how on earth could there be so much suffering in the world? And that didn't seem to make any sense to him. So he'd given up his own belief, but now he wanted to build up a secular ethics, and he had this view that we were at the very, very beginning of this journey, that we'd had, hundreds, thousands of years thinking about these issues, but only through a theological lens. And now we could begin to think about ethics afresh, which might bring us to the same conclusions or different conclusions, but in any case, it had to be based on different arguments and on a different foundation. So I think there was definitely a link there with his missionary background.
Yeah. I got that sense when I was reading about it. It's like, it's very interesting how, you never know how someone's life will be, and how he does have this kind of zeal for his way of trying to illustrate what he was trying to say of this kind of morals in a kind of secular framework. He had his time at Oxford, and you talk about his time at Eton as a student and stuff, but his time at Oxford, he was a journalist. So I want to bring in two pieces here, I guess. The piece about while he was at Oxford was there was the journalism aspect. How helpful do you see that for him as a writer? And we talk about his approach to writing his books, kind of trudging along, trying to get them done. But his role as a writer. But also, do you think this time had any impact on his? I wouldn't say photojournalism, but I'll say photography. His hobby of photography. Where did that kind of come in? So this is more of the personal stuff, and how does it kind of relate to what he did, kind of professionally or as a day job with philosophy? What was this time, I guess, in Oxford with the writing and maybe some of the photography? How did these things kind of form for him as a person?
Well, the unfortunate answer to that, I think, is that they're in some ways very unrelated to his philosophy. So, as you say, he has been to the most famous prep school in England called Eton, and from Eton he's gone on to Oxford, where he studies history, not philosophy. And he's obviously a very, very brilliant person. His tutors are in awe of him. I think they would very much like him to be an academic in history, but he's not really sort of emotionally attached to history. But while he's in Oxford, as well as being a very brilliant academic student, he gets involved in a whole bunch of things, including, as you say, journalism. And he's quite a fluent writer. At school, he's dabbled in poetry. Between school and university, he goes off and works for the New Yorker. And later, when he's at Oxford, he publishes a poem, aged only 19, in the New Yorker, which is a rather kind of extraordinary thing to accomplish. Not many 19-year-olds get poems published in the New Yorker. So he had a sort of poetic sensibility, and he clearly was able to describe things rather beautifully, and he had an extraordinary kind of wide vocabulary and a sort of range, and an understanding, I suppose, of rhythm and things like that makes poetry work, and which makes journalism work. But almost none of that, I think, is present in his academic philosophy. So when he starts writing academically, he has a very, very dry style, and his books are kind of staccato sentences. He often sort of repeats, I mean, not entirely, but he goes over points because his main aim is just to make the philosophy as transparent and as clear as he possibly can. So all those journalistic flourishes that were present when he was an undergraduate, that poetic sensibility that he clearly seemed to have, as an undergraduate. That seems to disappear when he's starting writing philosophy. And when he's writing philosophy, he has a very, very distinctive style. So I think if you were to present me with kind of a paragraph or two paragraphs of Derek, even if I couldn't remember what those paragraphs were, I think I would be able to spot Derek's writing DNA. It's a very, his sentences are very, very Derek. So photography was your second question. He gets given a camera by his uncle when he's quite young, and he starts dabbling in photography. He does a bit when he's at Oxford, but that's on a very sort of amateur basis. It's only after university that he takes it up and it becomes an obsession with him. And as you'll have read in the book, he becomes obsessed in particular with three cities. There's the city that he spends his life in, which is Oxford, which I don't know if you've been there, but it is an unbelievably beautiful city. And anybody who comes to the UK, they should definitely visit Oxford and Cambridge. There's lots of beautiful cities in the UK, but Oxford is spectacular. And Derek, it was very convenient for him, of course, because he was based there. So he took lots of photographs of Oxford and a famous building called the Radcliffe Camera, which was viewable from his room. So he didn't even need to leave his room to take some beautiful shots. And then the other two cities he became preoccupied with were what was then called Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, and Venice. So, I think he had very good aesthetic judgment, because those are three spectacular cities. And every year, for many, many years, he would go to both St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and to Venice. And he would get up very, very early at sunrise, and he would take photographs of the same buildings every single year. And then he might return at sunset and take the same buildings again under slightly different lighting conditions. And then he would return to the UK, and this was before you could digitally enhance photos. He would send these photos off to a developer, initially one in Italy, later one in London. And these photographs would come back and forth between Derek and the developer. And he would make these constant demands about how he would want the photographs changed. He had a kind of a perfectionist instinct about everything, but it's in a way most obvious about his photography. And there were things he didn't like about some of his photographs. For example, there might be a lamppost that he wanted removed. He didn't really like people in his photographs, so he would sometimes ask for the people to be removed from his photographs. He was constantly adjusting the color and changing the kind of oranges and pinks and so on. And it would go back and forth. And he was on an academic salary. He was a decent salary, but he was not massively wealthy. But he would spend thousands of pounds trying to make the perfect photograph. And eventually he gives that up in about year 2000. And from that moment, he just concentrates on philosophy. But until then, he's been spending, as I say, every year going back and forth between these various cities.
I remember reading the book, and it's very fascinating. What I guess two questions there. What do you make of the kind of almost perseverative aspect of the pictures every year, same place, all of the changes or the corrections that he wants? What do you make of that just generally, and why those three cities? Those three cities, I haven't been to either of them actually, but I'm sure they're very beautiful. But why those, or why not different cities every year? What do you make of this? I guess in terms of his personality or his makeup, or what was going on in his head.
He gave an interview to the New Yorker when On What Matters, the second book, comes out. And there's a big profile of him in the New Yorker. And there's a nice quote in there, I think, where he says something like, when I find something, he doesn't put it in these terms, but the message is, when I find something I like, I'm very happy to sort of repeating that pleasure, as it were, and I don't need a lot of variety. If I've discovered things that bring me joy, that's enough. So he could listen to the same pieces of music or watch the same movie over and over again. And again, he found these cities. He loved these cities. He loved these particular buildings. I mean, I think some of it was entirely arbitrary. So he'd visited Rome. He'd visited Florence. Rome and Florence are very, very beautiful. I mean, I happen to believe that Venice is even more beautiful than those two places. But equally, there are lots of other European cities that are very beautiful, like Prague. He wasn't interested in photographing Prague. So I think it speaks to his ability to sort of identify what he likes and then kind of stick to it. And that was a pattern, not just in photography, but in other aspects of his life as well.
This is so interesting. It's very, very interesting. So you talk about he has spent a lot of time in the U.S. and he was influenced by many people, including Rawls, and kind of pushing him out of the history kind of avenue of things and more into philosophy. I guess, he spent time here in the U.S. where I'm at. How do you think that was an influence? He spends time here in the U.S. He's spending time in Oxford. What do you? I don't know if there's other people that have done that. Usually, people will come here and they stay here, or But it seemed like there was a healthy amount of visiting across the pond and talking to different thinkers over here. How much of an impact, if any, do you think that had on him, both and the people he was influenced by here, and the amount of travel he did around the United States as well? How much of that do you think was influential?
Oh, it had a lot of influence. I mean, I think he sort of regarded New York in particular as a sort of second home. I mean, I think he loved New York. He'd been there, as I say, working for the New Yorker in his year off. He later, after his first degree, got something called a Harkness Fellowship, which was a 2-year kind of study in the United States. So he spent 2 years in the States at Columbia and then at Harvard. And then from quite a young age, once he'd become an academic, he was spending time almost every year in America. And he went to lots of different places, Princeton and Rice University, and he went to Denver, and he kind of lectured in various places. But then after a period, he had this kind of complex pattern of visiting NYU, Harvard, and Rutgers. And those were 3 universities that, in this kind of strange schedule, he would go to. I think he would go to 2 a year, in a kind of pattern, so that he would go to 2 different ones each year. I mean, it had a very direct influence in the sense that had he not had that Harkness Fellowship after Oxford, he may never have come across philosophers, because he was allowed to sort of do what he wanted when he went to the States, and he started attending philosophy lectures. And that was where he sort of fell in love with philosophy and decided that philosophy was for him. So it was completely kind of fundamental to his future life, that his time in America. But then subsequently, it was important to him. Well, I mean, it was financially important to him because it was another source of income for him. But more importantly, I think, many of his closest friends were American philosophers. And I mean, Oxford's an amazing place to be a philosopher, because it has an enormous number. I think there must be more philosophers in Oxford, this is almost certainly true, than any other university in America or in the UK. Because Oxford has something like 38, 39 colleges or something like that. Each college has at least 2 philosophers. Some have more. So I think there were 150 professional philosophers in Oxford. So if you're going to be a philosopher, Oxford's a great place to do it. But he had these close collaborations, close friendships with very important philosophers in America, like Tom Nagel, like Tim Scanlon. It was a close friend to a philosopher called Larry Temkin. So those relationships were, I think, very, very important to him. Shelley Kagan was another American philosopher who was important to his work. So I think for all those reasons, the States was, it mattered a great deal to him.
This is super interesting. I mean, when you have so many philosophers in Oxford and he's spending time here in the U.S., it's a super interesting experience to have. Again, not only, in terms of thinking, but also in terms of the exposure to different types of cultures. And I found that really how he kept doing that throughout his life. Very, very interesting.
So there's one thing I didn't know when I was started out on the book, and I think very few people knew. In fact, I'm not sure anybody I know knew about this, but when he went to Harvard, he studied under John Rawls. You mentioned John Rawls. And he was thinking of doing a PhD with Rawls. And it was a rule of the Harkness Fellowship that after you'd been in America for 2 years, you had to leave. And when you signed on to this fellowship, it was part of the deal that you had to leave. And then you were allowed to return up to America after I don't know what period of time, but you couldn't stay after those 2 years. And Derek, and this may be something to do with his old Etonian background, there's a history of Derek thinking that the rules don't apply to him. And so he would write to different institutions and say, I know there's this rule, but I wonder if you can, for me, sort of make this exception. And he tried to do the same with the Harkness Fellowship. So he said John Rawls had asked him to do a PhD, and he could have studied under Rawls. And he writes to the Harkness Fellowship team and says, I've got this opportunity. I know I'm supposed to leave after 2 years, but can you make an exception for me? And very unusually, because it almost always worked, they said, no, you've got to go. So he left the States and went to Oxford to start a philosophy degree, which he never completed. He never got a single philosophy degree. His only qualification was 1 degree in history. But he leaves America. But it's interesting to speculate how Derek's life and how political theory would be different had Derek stayed at Harvard, because then he would have been working with John Rawls. John Rawls, this was in the mid-1960s. John Rawls was working on his great work, A Theory of Justice, which comes out in 1971 and widely regarded as the most important work in political theory post-World War II. Derek wasn't all that keen on that book, and I think the book might have emerged in a very different form had Derek been studying under John Rawls. So, if we're allowed counterfactual history, that's an interesting avenue to pursue.
Yeah, who can say, right? But you have to imagine that his life would have been pretty different, I would say. Who knows all the things that could have arisen from that. But it's interesting how his life does go another way. And still, even within the world of philosophy, he is still a pretty big deal, which brings me to this major paper. Maybe you can tell me about this. I haven't read this paper, but he has this paper in the Philosophical Review in 1971 that everyone was talking about. Everyone was coming up to him and saying, this is amazing. So I haven't read it. I'm assuming you have, or at least know about it. What was the paper, and what was it that made everyone just kind of like, wow, like just this is unparalleled?
So he spends most of his life working on moral philosophy, but the paper that you're talking about, which was the first published paper, was on something called personal identity. And that's the question of what it is that makes a person through time the same person. So what is it that makes you the same person now than that you were when you were a baby, and the same person now that you will be when you're 85. And lots of philosophers had discussed this in the past. Lots of, many members of the philosophical canon had discussed it. John Locke, David Hume, and so on. I think the reason Parfit got interested in this was when he was a Harkness Fellow, between the 2 years, So you do 2 years, and then there's a summer between the 2 years. And what they expected of you as a Harkness Fellow was that you would travel around America. So you were given the money to buy a car. And Harkness Fellows were supposed to see as much of America as they could. And I guess, although this wasn't stated, they were supposed to fall in love with America, as many of them did, and be American files for the rest of their life. And Parfit duly took his money, bought a car, and he had a girlfriend at the time, and he invited her to join him on his road trip across America. And his girlfriend, had a friend, a woman friend called Anne, who had a friend called David Wiggins, who Derek wouldn't have known from Adam. But David Wiggins was a philosopher who is still alive and is a very, very famous philosopher. And David Wiggins at that time was a very young philosopher writing about personal identity. So I think as they were traveling across America, going through New Mexico, and they picked up David Wiggins in San Francisco, I think, then they went to LA. And then they went across, and they ended up in Mexico itself, actually. They dumped the car. They would have been talking about, I think, personal identity. David Wiggins doesn't remember this, but that, I think, is why Parfit ends up focusing initially on personal identity, because he would have had these chats purely coincidentally with this bloke who happened to be in his car on his road trip around America. So he writes this famous paper, and for many years he's invited all around the world to discuss personal identity. And he jokes that when he was introduced in front of these audiences, the chair would say, "And this is Derek Parfit, who's written about personal identity," and then realized that they hadn't read anything else that Derek had written, because he had written nothing else. He became internationally famous in the small world of philosophy on the back of this personal identity paper, and he makes various claims in that paper. Later on, personal identity is the one area of philosophy that he slightly changes his mind about. But the core message, which is there right from the beginning, is that identity, what it is that makes me the same person, as I say, that I was 10 years ago, and that will be in 10 years' time. Identity is not really a very important question. What's important is whether you continue to survive in a psychological way, whether there's psychological connectedness between me and a future self. So if there's a future self that has my memories, my dispositions, my character, and so on, that's what I should care about. Whether I call that the same, identical to me or not, is not really what matters. What I should care about is whether I've got a sort of future self that has this psychological connectedness with my current self.
So it's interesting. I when I was reading the book, I was kind of laughing to myself, because I've had two conversations more recently about more so the self, but this very topic, and they're on the podcast. It's with it's a professor out at Stanford. The name will come to me in a minute. Brian Lowry, and he teaches. He's a social psychologist by training, and we have this ongoing debate about the self. And my position is pretty similar here to what Derek's is that we have, through time, a continuous self, right? Now, Brian's position is that the self is all socially constructed. It doesn't exist, right? All of it is socially constructed as we do it. So we could be anything that we want to be. And his claim is, when you're talking about the self that's there through time, it's, the person inside your head that's pulling the levers. There's a core self, and I don't believe that. I think the self as somebody that's there is a sort of illusion. But I do think the things that we have, I think the psychological continuity is a good framing. That's what carries through. It has to. There are core elements of who we are. Right. If all of that is too interchangeable, then there's nothing constant about what it makes me to be me. So,
right. That was a Derek position. That was a Derek position. There's no essence of us. Mm-hmm. What we are is we're a body and our mind. We're constantly evolving and changing. There's nothing that sort of inside us, as it were, that makes me the same person. So you can contrast that position with a Christian belief in the soul.
Yeah.
So if you're a Christian, you have a very straightforward answer to what it is that makes me the same person. We've got the same soul. So I don't know when the soul arrives. I don't know when at conception, or maybe does it arrive a few days after conception? I can't remember. And the soul sort of goes off somewhere into heaven or hell. I don't know what, when there's biological death. But what makes me is the soul. Well, Derek's obviously a secular thinker. He's given up religious belief. He doesn't believe in a soul. He doesn't think there's any reason to believe in a soul. There's no evidence for a soul. So he looks for something else, and he says that he can't find anything else. So we are in a way that a football club is made up of its. There are kind of rules, and there are the players, and there's the manager, and the coaches, and there's the stadium. And if you ask, yes, but what is it that makes that football club the same football club? All you have is, no, that's what the football club is. It's made up of those bits and pieces. That's what the football club is. What is a human being? What is I'm just my mind and my body, and that's it. There's no essence of me, and that's very much in line with the philosophy of David Hume, who asks us to introspect and to look inside us and try and identify the self. And Hume says, no, when I look inside me, all I see is impressions. I see that I'm looking at my laptop at the moment. I'm seeing a microphone, and I'm seeing a strange picture on behind your head. I don't know what it is. I've got these various impressions. I have no impression of the self. That I don't perceive. So in that sense, his philosophy of personal identity is similar to some of the important philosophers of the past. He uses a number of interesting philosophical thought experiments to reach his conclusions, and that sort of is a mark of his originality. So he comes up with ways of arguing for his position. And I mean, that's a mark of his philosophy generally. He was very, very good at conjuring up sort of imaginary hypotheses to test various theories and intuitions.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's important that we do have this idea of, who we are through time. And a lot of it is dependent on our memories. But I firmly believe, I don't know how to completely explain it, but that there are things about us that are kind of constant. So who I am at 5, I'm still that same person in some ways, in my view. And other people would say, no, you're always evolving and changing. And I agree with that as well. And I don't believe in a soul. So many people might see it that way. But I think that it's like a building a house. You have all of these things, and like all of the bits and pieces are there to make it come together. But how would you be able to describe, well, I know this person? If you bump into a friend from, primary school, right, let's say, and you bump into them 30 years later, it's like, yeah, I know that guy. Yeah, it's the same guy, right? Yeah, he's different. His physical appearance is different. Maybe he's matured and he's grown and he has different ideas, but somewhere in there, it's the same person I knew when I was, in first grade or second grade.
So I think Derek doesn't want to say somewhere in there, but he does want to share. He doesn't want to say somewhere in there is the same person, but he does want to share your intuition. I mean, when you see somebody who you haven't seen for 30 years, you say, yeah. I mean, they lost all their hair or whatever, but
right.
But I sort of recognize that person. And what do you mean by that? You mean that if they were very kind of mean, they're still mean. If they were very generous, they were still. I mean, had they changed completely, you might say, oh, it just feels like a different person, right? You wouldn't necessarily say he feels like the same person. You only say, yeah, it's the same person because you see resemblances between that person much later on and the person you knew much earlier on. So I think that's entirely consistent with with Derek's position about having no essence.
Yeah, I would agree. So he gets to he has this one paper, and then he finally gets to writing Reasons and Persons. And you talk about in the book that it took a while, and that it was a process for him. Why was it so long for him to get to actually writing it and publishing it? And then maybe you could talk about some of the themes from that book in terms of being impartial in our ethics and looking more on the common good than just ourselves or our family, which again are very interesting ideas. So just tell us a little bit about the formation of that book and then some of the content there.
Okay. Well, the book comes out in 1984. Derek becomes what's called a prize fellow at All Souls College, Oxford in 1967. All Souls College has a unique space in Oxford in that it's not true now, but it was true then and true for many years afterwards. It was the only place where it was just for researchers. There were no undergraduates. It was just a research institution. And it was a very privileged place to be, and there was a lot of competition to get into All Souls. And one of Derek's few failures was he failed to get in there as a historian in 1964. And it's only when he applies as a philosopher later on, when he's now fallen in love with philosophy, he tries again, and he gets in on the second attempt in 1967. That gave him 7 years to 1974. After that, he applied for another fellowship at All Souls, which gave him another 7 years to 1981. The second 7-year period was called a Junior Research Fellowship. In 1981, he applies for what's called a Senior Research Fellowship. Now, a Senior Research Fellowship is basically a job for life. And had he got that, he would have been set up for life, and in fact, he did eventually get it. But at the time he applied in 1981, all the other fellows who vote on who you should give the Senior Research Fellowship to, they looked at his publishing record. I mean, I say all the other fellows. In fact, it was a very small minority of fellows who looked at his record and said, well, he's been there 14 years and he's had this extraordinarily privileged position of not having, he did a bit of lecturing and so on, but he had virtually no obligations. And in 14 years, he hadn't produced a single book. And they said to Derek, and this came as a great shock to him because he thought he would just be automatically promoted, as it were, to Senior Research Fellowship. They said to Derek, we're not going to give it to you. We'll agree a compromise. And the compromise is this. You have 3 years to publish a book. And if you come back with a book in 1984, we will reconsider your application for the Senior Research Fellowship, that job for life. And if you haven't produced a book, we're going to throw you out of Oxford. And so this was perhaps the biggest crisis in Derek's life. As I say, it blindsided him. So he has to produce a book in 2 years because it takes a year from time of handing in a manuscript to the time that a book appears. So Reasons and Persons, which is a very big book of whatever it is, 450 pages, is written in 2 years' time, which is incredibly fast. And he almost kills himself. He almost goes bonkers writing that book. He's working night and day writing that book. And it sets a pattern for the rest of his life where he becomes obsessive about his work and the time he will devote to other things, or the lack of time he will devote to other things. So that's the history of the book. Well, there's a lot in it. I mean, perhaps I've already given a long answer. So perhaps I shouldn't give a long answer about what's in the book. But it's you can easily see it as 4 books. And when it came out, I think people wondered, well, why on earth have we got all these 4 big sections? So there's one section asking basically whether we should be selfish or whether we should be moral. the third section we've already discussed a bit, which is about personal identity. And the fourth big section is on future people. Obligations to people who are not yet born, our responsibilities to people who will exist but don't yet exist. And Derek basically invents that subgenre of moral philosophy. It doesn't exist before Derek. All the puzzles that we still have about how much we should care about future people, these are all puzzles and conundrums that were established by Derek. And people ask, well, what do all these sections have in common? Well, they are, as you say, they're sort of broadly consequentialist or impartial in that his conclusions for most of his arguments are that we should care about people in general rather than particular people. We should care about maximizing well-being generally rather than, caring particularly about myself or about my friends and family. So he's a kind of a consequentialist, or he's got utilitarian instincts. But in other ways, they've got little in common. And the reason that they're all there together is that Derek was working on multiple books. And when all souls say to him, you've got to produce one book, what he does is he just throws them all into that hat, as it were. There's a front cover and a back cover, and he throws all his other ideas in between these two covers. And they end up not being 4 books, but being one book. And so people, I think when the book came out, didn't realize that that was the origin of the book. And, now we know the history of it and the origin of it. We understand why these apparently very disparate ideas are all thrown together in this one extremely rich, powerful, dense book, Reasons and Persons.
Yeah, I like the way you describe it. It's I think that's helpful for people to kind of conceptualize it that way. I want to ask about this utilitarianism. So there's one piece in the book. I'll read it. It's interesting. It's interesting. People get a taste of this. So you get this example. So it says the most extreme, indeed shocking example of Parfit's instincts on dessert concerns a film about Adolf Hitler. Just as Parfit believed that the world could in no way be better if someone was unhappy or made to suffer, so he also believed the converse, that every bit of happiness should be welcomed. All other things being equal, it was better that a person be happy, even a person who had committed bad acts, than that they be unhappy. He once saw footage of Hitler performing a little jig, celebrating the French surrender to Germany in 1940. In fact, Parfit didn't know this. The film had been doctored and was an early example of fake news. What was Parfit's reaction to Hitler's jig? At least something good came out of a German victory. Now, how does this square? This is an example. It's a kind of amusing example of sorts. But how does this factor into being utilitarian? Right, that somebody, even the worst people, if they're happy, if there's a moment of that, they accept it as having that. What was he trying to find? I guess, how does that fit in within a utilitarian argument? And let me ask it that way.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that example, because I only put it in the book because I couldn't believe it when I came across this example. It's so extraordinary, and it is. Who else would have that reaction? That it's such a bizarre reaction to what he'd just seen.
Yes.
And from a utilitarian point of view, one ought to say that mostly we don't want bad people to be happy, because if bad people, if that sets a bad example. If we look around us and see that bad people are generally happy, well, that might encourage us to be bad, right? I mean, on the whole, we don't want bad people to enjoy the suffering of others. That's a terrible solution from a utilitarian point of view. That's going to encourage all the wrong kind of dispositions and actions. So a utilitarian, generally, as a rule, doesn't want people like Hitler to be to have a great deal of satisfaction from the suffering of other people. So when Derek is looking at Adolf Hitler doing his little jig and saying at least something good came out of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, he's assuming a sort of subclause, which is all other things being equal. All other things being equal. So that's very important. So if everything else was equal, if the world was unchanged, apart from whether Hitler was happy or whether Hitler was unhappy, then according to Derek, it's better if Hitler's happy. Nothing good comes from the suffering of a person, however bad they are. Of course, as I said, in the actual world, the world is not like that. In the actual world, you don't want bad people to be happy. But in that particular case, if it changes nothing else, if Hitler's happiness affects nothing else, it's better that he's happy than he's not happy. And it's related but not identical to Derek's view about, you mentioned dessert, which, and by dessert we don't mean chocolate brownies, we mean moral dessert. Right. So Derek is what in the philosophical literature is called a determinist. So Derek believes that the idea of free will makes no real sense. That just as if you roll a billiard ball and hit another billiard ball, it will go off the second billiard ball will go off in a different direction according to the speed and the angle of the first ball and so on. That's all determined by physics, the laws of physics. So, human beings are made up of molecules and atoms and so on. We're just as much part of the deterministic world as billiard balls. We're no freer than billiard balls in Derek's view. And, the question of free will is a question that still divides philosophers. But that was Derek's position. He didn't believe in free will. If you don't believe in free will, if you think that ultimately everything that you and I do is determined by pre-existing causes, then you can find no room for moral responsibility. Because if I, set light to somebody's house, I'm an arsonist, and, I cause them terrible property damage and maybe cause humans to kind of physically suffer. If I've been caused to do that, in the same way as if somebody held a gun to my head and said, you have to do that. If I've been caused to do that by all the things that led up to that, my decision to burn that house down, I'm not morally responsible for it in any deep sense. And so Derek's view was that there's no such thing as sort of deep moral responsibility. At one level, we can say, well, of course you're responsible because you're the one who lit the match. But in terms of moral responsibility, deep moral responsibility, you're not responsible because you were determined to do it by all those pre-existing conditions. So he didn't think anybody deserved to suffer. Equally, although he talks much less about this, the reverse of that is if nobody deserves anything bad to happen to them, nobody deserves any praise. So you shouldn't praise any kind of hero or Nobel Prize winner because what they've done is equally determined by pre-existing causes. So he didn't believe in desert. But in any case, even if he had done, I think from his utilitarian perspective, he would have thought that retribution can't be justified. So retribution is the idea that if I've done something bad, I deserve to be punished. Whether or not that punishment acts as a deterrent to other people, whether or not that punishment prevents me from doing further bad things in the past, retribution is the idea that I simply deserve it because I've done something bad. Now, Parfit thought that was a ridiculous view to have about the world, that there may be very good reasons to punish people, but they were utilitarian reasons. So it makes perfect sense to threaten to punish people if they commit crimes because you don't want people to commit crimes, and punishment will act as a deterrent. And if somebody is a homicidal murderer, it makes perfect sense to lock that person up, because if you don't lock that person up, the homicidal murderer will go and murder other people. So there were very good reasons from a utilitarian point of view to have the practice and the institutions of punishment. But it isn't a good argument to say the person we're punishing deserves punishment. It's a good thing that person suffers, irrespective of whether it has any utilitarian consequences. And that was what he rejected. So anything bad that happens to the world that doesn't have any good consequences is to be abhorred, and we should do something. We should try not to get into that position. We shouldn't encourage any suffering if it's going to have no good effects. And likewise, every bit of goodness is better than no bit of goodness, all other things being equal. So to get back to the Hitler example, it's better Hitler is happy rather than Hitler's unhappy, so long as it has no other sort of bad effects. It's better that somebody's happy than they're unhappy.
Isn't part of the debate here, though, also about the impact that it has on other people? So some people may say, well, if somebody sees somebody getting away with something, they're more likely to do that as well. They're going to also do that. But other people will say, no, that's not true. That's not quite how it works.
Well, so there we're just left with an empirical debate. Okay? And I don't suppose Parfit has got he's a philosopher. I don't suppose he's got anything interesting to say about that question. I mean, to answer that question, you need a sociologist or a criminologist to say whether deterrence actually works. I mean, if Derek would say, well, look, if it doesn't work, then we shouldn't use it. And if it does work, then we've got a rationale to use it. And as I say, if other people are inspired by people getting away with crimes, or by people being joyful or flourishing on the back of doing bad things, and that encourages them, well, that's a very good reason from a utilitarian consequentialist point of view to discourage it and to make sure that those are not seen as good examples. But whether or not they are becomes an empirical matter that Derek has nothing to say about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I also think that there's an aspect of scale here as well. If it's a one-to-one kind of thing, maybe there's more variance there. But when you have, massive amounts of people observing or seeing this, and it's at scale, I would agree that there should be deterrence for certain. So I want to ask about two. These are two separate things, but I'll just pitch them and you can answer them accordingly. He has this idea of a non-identity problem, which I thought was interesting. And I was also curious for what you think his views on equality were. So these are two separate issues, but you can just take the first one, this non-identity problem. How does that maybe fit with what we were talking about earlier with kind of personal identity, and then his views on equality?
So the non-identity problem is only very loosely connected to his ideas on personal identity. He does it with this example, but you can imagine. I mean, there are tropical diseases that exist to this day, and the Foreign Office. I don't know if the State Department has the same advice, but the Foreign Office might say, if you go to these various countries that have these tropical diseases, when you come back, advice to women and potential fathers: try not to get pregnant within the next 3 months, because if you do and you have this disease, you're likely to end up with a baby that might have severe disabilities.
We have something like that on the State Department website, all the countries, and there's like a tier system of here's the warning signs and what could happen, and there's something similar to that, I think.
Right. So obviously we're subjected to the same diseases. But I'll tell you the example Derek uses. So he imagines a 14-year-old girl who's thinking about having a baby, and the option is that the 14-year-old girl, what you want to persuade the 14-year-old girl to do is postpone the decision to have a baby until she's a mature woman, because it's good for it's not good for the girl to have a baby at age 14, but also there's this powerful intuition that it's not good for the baby. That if the baby is born to a 14-year-old child, that is a very bad start in life. And Derek spots something which is extremely obvious, but it took Derek to spot it. Nobody else had seen that. It took Derek spotted something extremely obvious, which is, well, if the child the 14-year-old girl postpones having the baby, then the baby that will be born 3 or 4 months later, 10 years later, whenever the girl decides to have a baby, won't be the same child. Okay. Now, we were talking about the tropical diseases. Let's say you've gone to a country with a tropical disease. You come back. You decide not to try and get pregnant because you're worried that you may have this disease, possibly, in which case you'll get a severely disabled child. You decide to postpone having a baby or conception for another few months. Again, if you do that, the child that will eventually be born is obviously not going to be the same child as the child that would have been born if you got pregnant immediately after coming back from the tropical country. Now, why is this interesting? Normally, when we think about morality, we think that something is good or bad because it's good or bad for particular people. So if I get set light to a house, I'm in an arsonist mood today. If I set light to a house, then the reason it's bad is because I've affected somebody's property or because I've put somebody's life at risk. There's a particular person who's affected or particular people who are affected. What Derek spotted is that there are things that seem to be bad which aren't bad for any individual people. So to go back to the example of the girl who's thinking of having a child, age 14, were she to go ahead and have that child, the child would not have a great start in life, but presumably the child would have a life that was better than nothing. And by postponing having a child, you haven't helped the child that would have been born by the 14-year-old, because that child would not have existed. Okay, so there isn't a single person who has been harmed by the decision by the 14-year-old girl to have the child. She hasn't harmed her child because although her child doesn't have a great start in life, the child is born and the life is better than nothing. And had she not taken the decision to have the child then and done the sensible thing and postponed her decision, a different child would have existed. So if she goes ahead and has the child, we think that she's done something silly and maybe something wrong, maybe, but she hasn't affected badly any particular person. And Derek notices that a lot of moral problems have that structure. So the one he talks about is climate change, and he imagines that we take some drastic action about climate change. For example, we ban the use of cars or ban planes. Well, if you do something drastic like that, you're going to affect who's born, okay? Because, I mean, as he puts it, try and imagine you being born without the invention of the train. All of us are the product of a particular sperm meeting a particular egg at a moment in time. And if we change the world by banning cars or banning planes, we're going to affect who gets created, okay? Different people are going to end up in the world. So if you imagine two possible scenarios, in one scenario, we do nothing about climate change, and 3 or 4 generations down the line, we end up with a group of people who've got very miserable lives because, I mean, their lives are still better than nothing, but they're faced with all sorts of catastrophes and problems, and there's drought and there are floods and so on because we haven't looked after planet Earth. And the alternative scenario is that we do something, and 3 or 4 generations down the line, we have a set of people, and their lives are much better than that. Their lives are much more flourishing than that, and they don't face those same sorts of problems. But if we opt for the first option and do nothing about climate change, we're not harming any particular people. Because had we done something drastic about climate change, a whole different set of people would exist. So it's a puzzle about how we think about morality. And he says, well, you can't say that doing nothing about climate change is bad because it's bad for any particular person. It's not, because 3 or 4 generations down the line, there's going to be a completely different set of people existing on the planet. What you have to say is, given the choice between, let's say, 3 or 4 generations down the line, there being 8 billion very kind of contented, flourishing lives, and another option where 3 or 4 generations down the line, there are 8 billion people, completely different people, whose lives are much less flourishing because they're faced with all the problems that climate change throws up, we should prefer the first option to the second. So obviously, given the choice between 2 sets of lives, one of which are flourishing, one of which are much less flourishing, we should prefer the flourishing lives, but not because it's better for any particular person, just because we're comparing 2 different sets of human beings. That was a very long-winded way of explaining.
No. It's great. It's great. It's something. I'm gonna listen back to this, and I'm really gonna think about that, because I don't think it's something that people think about on a regular basis, but I think it's something that we all interact with, I should say, whether we realize it or not, which is really, really interesting to think about ideas of this future people, right? And what that's like, and it's interesting. It's very, very interesting.
I didn't answer the second part of your question, so let me just tell you a very little bit about equality. So he only writes one paper on equality. He gives a talk in Kansas, actually, and he then turns that into a paper, and it's a very interesting paper. And the basic claim in the paper is that if you have most of us think that equality is of value in and of itself. Even if we're conservative, we might think, well, equality, given the choice between a more equal and a less equal world, other things being equal, the more equal world is better. And then, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, the value of equality seems to take on greater pertinence. So a socialist or a kind of communist going even further left might think it's the dominant value. Equality is really what matters. And Derek's very simple point is to claim that equality per se can't be of value. And he talks about that with reference to what he calls the leveling down argument. So if you imagine that you're on one side of the world, let's say you're in a place called Baltimore, America, and let's say I'm in a place called London, UK, and let's say it's before there's any transport. We don't know each other exists. Okay, and let's say you have a life that we value on some kind of scale of flourishing of 100, and let's say here in London I have a life of only 70. Now, if equality per se is of value, we don't know about each other, so I'm not jealous of you. I don't know that you've got a much better life than me. But if equality per se is of value, then if I reduce your quality of life from 100 down to 70 so that it's the same as my quality of life, if equality per se is of value, then in one way, we've made the universe better by bringing you down to my level so that we're both now at the level of 70. And he says that can't be right. I've made your life less flourishing, more miserable, and I've done nothing to my life. I haven't improved my life anymore. And, I don't know about your existence, so it doesn't affect my status or envy or jealousy or anything like that. All I've done is reduce your quality of life to make the universe more equal. Well, that, according to Derek, has done nothing of value to the universe. Equality per se can't be of value. Insofar as equality matters, it must matter for other reasons. So that's his basic argument about equality.
Yeah. It's. I've been thinking about that a lot recently because it gets talked about a lot and various things. And it's just equality is a right and all these things. And I always kind of first. Well, what do we mean when we say equality? How does that look? How does that present itself? And I think those are questions people should think about deeply, as opposed to just spewing off all these like words that we have as favorites for us. And that's not to say I'm against equality necessarily, or in certain circumstances. I think we should, as humans, but I think we should have equality. But there is, I think, it's complicated. I think, like many constructs are. So the last two questions here. You talk about, his time between 2003 and 2010 is, relatively uneventful, at least on a public framework. And I'm assuming a lot of this stuff is on, his time is getting on What Matters completed. Again, it's massive, so you had to write it at some point. So just tell us a little bit about, he finishes on What Matters. Did he want it to be that big? What was he trying to say with all these big volumes? And then the legacy of Parfit. How can we get more people to know about him and his work, and to really understand him for who he is?
Yeah, so he comes to believe that if morality is not objective, then his life is meaningless and all our lives are meaningless. And so he wants to argue that morality, there are facts about morality. I mean, not quite in the same way as there are facts about the natural world, but nonetheless, there are things about which it's possible to say one proposition about morality is right and one is wrong, that we have reasons to do things and to behave in certain ways, irrespective of whether we want to behave in certain ways, that morality has this objective basis. And he didn't want to work on this in his early part of his career because he thought the question was just too difficult. And then in the last 20 years of his life, it's the question that preoccupies him, and he spends all his waking hours thinking about it. And he wants to convince all the major opponents that he has around the world that he's right. So one reason the book gets bigger and bigger is that he sends out drafts of the book and there are objections to it, and he responds to the objections and sends it back, and then there's more objections, he responds to that. He wants to respond to every single objection in the book because he wants to prove that he's thought of everything. So the major project is to prove that morality is objective. The subsidiary project, which is linked to that, is to show that all the traditions, the major traditions of moral philosophy, and in particular he talks about consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is a part, Kantianism, and contractualism, that these three strands of moral philosophy are not nearly as distinct as people believe or had believed that they were. And his metaphor for that is that moral philosophers are climbing the mountain from different sides. So the Kantian is climbing from one side, and the consequentialist from another, and the contractualist from another, and they meet at the top of the summit. And they see from the summit that they share all these things in common. So those are the two twin projects of this massive book of 1900 pages. His legacy, well, he only died in 2017. So as whoever it was said about the French Revolution, it's too early to tell. Who knows what his legacy is? He divides philosophers. With some philosophers just don't like the ways he does philosophy, but there were many serious philosophers who regard him as one of the great moral philosophers of the 20th century. Some go even further and say he's the most important moral philosopher since Sidgwick or since John Stuart Mill. And I think we'll see that sort of, we'll have be able to judge, I think, in 10, 15, 20 years' time. I think Reasons and Persons is a very great book, which will be read in decades to come. And some of his ideas about future people, I think, are beginning to work their way into policy. So I think, although he wasn't a public philosopher and didn't, to go back from right to where we started, didn't engage with the public, I think he'll end up influencing the public.
Yeah, I think that's important because we need to know, we need to have better ways or better kind of roadmap or template of how to understand the hard problems of morality, especially as we have a future that comes closer and closer to us. And I think a lot of his work is tremendous. And as you're saying, we're still kind of close to it. We're going to be doing his homework of sorts for in the next 25, 50 years, which is very interesting. Well, the book is called Parfit, Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality. It's out everywhere through Princeton. It's fabulous. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about Derek's life and just explain everything. I can tell you're used to this podcast life. I can tell. So, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing all the wonderful wisdom that you have. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely.